chapter 6?
Yeah, so let's start at chapter 6 and open by reading the first 8 verses or so to get a little background to the flood, keeping in mind that this violence has been growing now. So
yeah, there was murders between Cain and Abel. Now Lamech has killed people. This culture of violence in the Bible in the first few chapters of Genesis is escalating, and now in chapter 6 we're told this: when human beings began to increase in number on the earth, and daughters were born to them, the sons of God saw that the daughters of humans were beautiful, and they married any of them they chose. Then the Lord said, "My spirit will not contend with humans forever, for they are mortal. Their days will be 120 years." The Nephilim were on the earth in those days, and also afterward, when the sons of God went to the daughters of humans and had children by them. They were the heroes of old, men of renown. The Lord saw how great the wickedness of the human race had become on earth, and that every inclination of the thoughts of the human heart was only evil all the time. The Lord regretted that he had made human beings on the earth, and his heart was deeply troubled. So the Lord said, "I will wipe from the face of the earth the human race that I have created, and with them the animals, the birds, and the creatures that move along the ground. For I regret that I have made them." But Noah found favor in the eyes of the Lord.
Yes. And we want to go on here a bit, but this is a good stopping point because there's so much going on in this account. And there's been, of course, this is a place that a lot of people, when they read this, they have lots of questions and interest. And we could spend much time on every item here. The sons of God and the daughters of men, there's different views. Who are the sons of God? Are they kings and rulers? Are they people in the blessed line in chapter 5, the line of Seth? Are they others? The one thing we know is the term sons of God and terms like it, as it appears in Psalm 82, as it appears in Job 1 and 2 and similar terms. It always seems to be used of kind of angelic figures, but here no longer angels, but those who are fallen from that estate and now have taken up residence in among humanity, where they engage in sexual relations with the daughters of men who would most likely be human females, and out of that comes a group of people, of which at least part of that brings to the author's mind this term Nephilim. The Nephilim, who are also mentioned actually later, they appear in after the flood as well. They seem to be more of a social group, as it mentions here, giants. And in fact, the word itself in the original in Hebrew means the fallen ones. Not so much like the fallen angels, but as it's used in some ancient texts from this culture, fallen in battle, heroes and great warriors who are fallen. And the point here of that is it's just more and more violence. Yes, there may have been heroes who fought well or didn't or fought for the side of evil. Whatever the case, more and more people are dying. And that's the terrible thing. And out of that, God regrets it, because when God created people, when he created the world, he created them for life. And he created them to live fully and well and completely. And now that is being ended. And it is though people are giving into a violent nature that brings more and more death. And in the midst of this, God regrets even that he had created them. And his plan here might seem harsh and terrible, and yet, as the text suggests, every imagination of the human race was evil like this. And so the violence that it brought against people was such that if God had not intervened in some dramatic and even terrible manner, it would have brought death to the entire human race. Not only the people who eventually would die in the flood, but even people like Noah, who comes here at the end as mentioned as one who is righteous before God. And so God wished to preserve at least some part of the human race that was not given over totally in their hearts to evil, to destruction, to murder, to violence. And hopefully out of that there could come something good. So could you read a few more verses here as he moves in that?
Yeah, there is a question that comes to mind. Should I hold off on that?
No, bring it out.
So when I read this and hear you reflect on it, we see this building of violence on the earth from men, and then all of a sudden there almost seems like an interjection where there's an involvement of spirits or of demons or the sons of God. So what's the purpose of that? So all of a sudden we've moved from it being totally human-centered, like there's only human violence, and now there's human violence, but there also seems to be the genesis of this fallen ones group, which these heroes that promote violence and die in battle. It seems that there's a spiritual connection of demons with the daughters of men.
You see, and I'm so glad you brought that out, because I think it needs to be rounded out a little bit more in terms of what was said. Because it may sound like the sons of God coming down was a great thing. No, I don't think it was. But it was this attempt with, we want to call them angels, whatever you want to call them, with people and the human race, men and women, and with the Nephilim. It was this attempt to find a way to solve this, but solving it apart from God. And so what you do is you interject spiritual beings, however you understand them, into the DNA of the human race in the hope that that will reform, that will bring about some success. But it didn't. And in fact, it only increased the violence. And along with that, instead of that, you have this picture of people living longer, not living longer as feeble old people, but with strength so that they could do more violence. There's no end to it, and that's why God says at one point in what you read, 120 years. We're going to reduce the age with a few exceptions, but basically, that's what it's going to look like. People are not going to live any longer and have the opportunity to cultivate more and more of this evil. And so what we have here is one attempt to solve this, which ended in just further failure. And sadly, the forces, the spiritual forces, are not always those that are going to give us what we need. What we need is a whole new life, a whole new result coming out of that. And that comes not from even divine, semi-divine or divine figures like this, but it comes from the very Spirit of God.
Wow. And so, in other words, these humans are interacting with these demons in hopes of somehow undoing this culture of death, only to increase the culture of death.
Yes, exactly.
And then today people would say death and the culture of death is a lack of resources, it's race hate, it's rich versus poor. But do you ever hear a spiritual indication that there's maybe problems with us appealing to the teachings of demons, or there's demonic involvement? Like, how do we view, we look at this story, we say the demonic was involved in increasing violence. How do we think of that today? Do we say the demonic is involved in increasing violence as we see violence escalate in America and even across the world?
Well, the scriptures speak of this a lot in the New Testament. Not only does Jesus recognize demons and cast them out, but even more widely and broadly, Paul speaks of it in Ephesians 6, where he says, we don't wrestle against flesh and blood. And all the evil and all the various things you listed are part of that. But behind all of that, there are spiritual forces in high places, as the old versions spoke of it. We wrestle not against flesh and blood, but against spiritual forces, against rulers of darkness, against spiritual powers in high places that are set against us. And there is no recourse to that in terms of anything physical in this world. There is no weapon strong enough in this world to fight against us, that. There is no will that we might turn. It is ultimately only through God and through his Spirit, as sent by Christ, that now comes and fills us and enables us there in Ephesians 6, you can read about it in more detail, to put on the spiritual armor of God and to truly have victory over these enemies. Enemies not only of us, but enemies of humanity, enemies of life itself.
Well, that's amazing. Yeah, we said it all right there. It's the ultimate problem is not each other. We don't look at enemies as humans. We look at beyond that to the spiritual forces of darkness that are driving this. And so, in other words, that's really helpful because we can't just look at naturalistic explanations for why violence is happening. We have to say that there is a conflict of good and evil beyond the human versus human component. I think if we saw it that way, we would be more forgiving of each other, both perpetrator and victim, forgiving each other and not seeing each other so much as enemies, but as in the same war against spiritual evil.
Yes.
But that's so hard to see and so hard to remember that that's what's really the problem.
Yeah.
Right now, I think a lot of us are tempted to point the finger at each other. White versus black, Democrat versus Republican, left versus right, American versus other country. Take your faction. There's a million factions, and they fight another faction. But this teaching says there's actually something beyond that. There is these spiritual forces of evil that we see right in Genesis. People are tempted to appeal to for help, but they only bring more evil.
Yeah. And not only that, but this truth of the Spirit of God being sent is the only solution. It's the only way. It's not just a way. It is ultimately the reviving of what God has called us to be, reviving our spirit, becomes the only way to find a solution to all of these troubles that come out of the wickedness of the human heart. I want to go on. Noah, of course, builds the ark. He prepares it, and he and his family and various animals are saved through it as the floods rise, and as the whole world is, as it were, covered in water, and you have an end to that violent race, that violence of humanity. But after 150 days of this, God then begins to change. And that's where, if you could turn to chapter 8, and please read the first 2 verses there.
So this is me talking about Noah, who found favor with God.
Yes.
And now it says, but God remembered Noah and all the wild animals and the livestock that were with him in the ark.
Yeah.
And he sent a wind over the earth, and the waters receded.
Yes, exactly. That word for wind is the same as the word for spirit. So as we said, wind and spirit are the same word in the original, both in the Old Testament language of Hebrew and the New Testament language of Greek. They're the same. And there's a purpose for that, because as God sends this wind, it causes the waters to recede. They begin to go down. God remembers Noah. Remembering is such an important theme, and it's used for the first time here in the Bible. And it's God who remembers. Not that he has forgotten Noah, but when God remembers, he remembers here for the salvation of Noah, and ultimately the salvation and good of the human race. that now God sends the Spirit which blows back or moves back the waters so that there can again be dry land and that there can again be people coming out of the ark, animals coming out of the ark, repopulation of the world, and a covenant given where God will promise never again to destroy the world in this way. But the Spirit, by bringing this wind, brings a new creation and a new life into the world. And with it, the promise of God not to destroy the world in such a way, but also the caution of God in Genesis 9, verse 6. Let's just read that. And
Genesis 9, verse 6, whoever sheds human blood, by humans shall their blood be shed. For in the image of God has God made mankind.
Yeah, absolutely. Humanity is made in God's image, and God's image is to give life, to maximize life, to increase flourishing among the whole human race, not one group or another. And here is a warning that the shedding of human blood, of innocent blood, for no good reason, simply out of anger and violence and so many of the things you spoke about, has in its end a judgment and justice from God that will bring about the death of the people involved to do this. And this is where I believe the state steps in and is called upon to thereby terminate this kind of violence of humanity against humanity. And that, I think, is part of the picture that is here and is the part of the inheritance of the whole story of the flood, setting that alongside of the promise of the work of the Spirit to bring life even in the midst of the greatest violence and the greatest destruction. And that is a promise that we have coming through the work of the Holy Spirit, the bringer of life.
It seems amazing that there's so many actors in this story so far. We've talked about Cain and Abel. We've talked about Lamech, his wives, other people that have been killed, this group of fallen ones, now Noah, livestock and the animals. And the Spirit is just one word, and yet he seems to be the main actor in what we're discussing.
Yeah.
It's the Spirit who needs to bring life, but it's just this small little blip in what we've just read.
Yes, and some scholars, many who have looked at this very carefully, have seen in that one little blip there in chapter 8, verse 1, that's the center point of this whole story. Wow. Everything reverses at that point. Everything that was going in one way now comes back. That was going to death, to murder, to destruction, now comes back to life and to the cultivation of life and to the promise of the recreation of everything.
So, in other words, the violence is ramping up into this point in chapter 8. Yeah. The Spirit is mentioned. That's an inflection point, and there seems to be a switch in direction.
Exactly.
And now the culture of life and God bringing life is being reintroduced into this story that has become so bleak.
Yeah, exactly. And there, I think, is a good place to end for today, and just to see God and His Spirit is a bringer of life and of hope. Benefited from this presentation, and just want to thank Effective Presentations for the use of the studio and equipment that this is coming to you.